And a little bit about our presenter. I think a lot of Inova customers do recognize Jay. Jay is the president and founder of Service Agility, a consulting and training company dedicated to improving customer service and call center operations. There he provides strategic and tactical guidance across all industries for enterprises that seek to optimize customer interactions. And prior to starting his own firm, Jay spent 8 years as the vice president of consulting for ICMI. And before that, he spent 17 years running call center operations. Jay leads consulting and training engagements throughout the United States and abroad, and his client list ranges from small startup operations all the way up to the largest Fortune 500 corporations. And as many of you know, Jay does fulfill services for Inova, including our real-time performance management assessment service. And with that, I will hand it over to Jay. Jay, are you, can you hear me okay?
I sure can, Jim. How about me? Am I coming through?
You sound fine, Jay.
All right, sounds good. Jim, I'm going to move up one in the slides. It wasn't moving for me before, so it should have moved to agenda. Is that good?
Has, yes.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks very much for the introduction, Jim. I appreciate it. And just to echo a couple of things that you mentioned, please do feel free to ask any questions as they come up. You can just chat them in the chat bar there during the session. So I wanted to mention that. We will have time at the end, and I'll be glad to go over those, whether it's about the specific topic that we're talking about here or anything with real-time management in general is fine. So I wanted to mention that. I also wanted to emphasize as well, we got the next session that we have coming up, I think is September 10th, and it's just kind of a fun session. It's a tips and tricks session where I'm going to go over a few items that, some tools that people may not be aware of and some little tips and things like that. But just, you know, some good items that I think if you're in this business, if you're doing a lot of real-time management for your job, may be helpful for you. So that having been said, let me get on with what we're doing here today. You see the agenda in front of you there. We've got 4 main topics. I'm going to start really where you folks have to start when we're talking about managing in a real-time environment, and that's with the right numbers. It's the numbers that really guide us. And, you know, the thing about contact centers that's different from a lot of other organizations is, you know, where they often don't have enough numbers, we've got too many, right? So, you know, we've got to kind of cull through and get the right one so that we can react properly. But the first step is getting those right ones. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Then I'm going to drop down. I'm going to talk about the role of chance. I won't get into that into any great details, but I'll talk about it at a higher level and how chance plays into everything that we do as it relates to real-time management. And the point of that discussion, I mean, there's not a lot that we can do about it, but it's important to understand it and know about it when we get to that third step, which is when we're setting those thresholds and coming up with those reaction plans, because the reality of it is we have to consider, is chance playing into this, or are we really in a trend that we have to respond to? So that those second and third items will go together. Finally, we're going to talk about communicating with the agents. You know, the end of our real-time management practices is always something that has to do with communication. We're communicating with agents or reserve agents or whomever. And I think sometimes we don't give enough thought to how we go about doing that, because if we don't do it in the most effective manner, then obviously we're not going to get the reactions that we want. So that's what we'll go through there. So let's start up at the top. We're going to talk about using what I consider to be the right metrics. So a lot of different metrics in contact centers, and the ones that we tend to look at for real-time management, I break into real-time and then near real-time. So when I'm looking at the real-time numbers, first of all, I'm reminding myself, well, I call them real-time, but I always have to remember that the system refreshes on a regular basis. So Some systems truly are real-time where the data is always refreshed, but most are not. Most phone systems are refreshing every 6 seconds, every 10 seconds, maybe 15 or 20 seconds. It's a good thing to know in your system how often it's actually refreshing the data, because that gives you an idea of, what kind of lag there may be between what you're looking at and what's actually happening. Most of the time, of course, a few seconds here and there doesn't matter to us, but in real-time management, it can. So, we just want to keep in mind that, it may be stale dated by a few seconds or so, but these are the real-time metrics. First of all, calls in queue, how many calls are sitting there? Secondly, the longest wait. So of those calls that are waiting, take the one that's been waiting the longest and how long has it been waiting. Those are a couple of key real-time statistics. And then a lot of the data that has to do with agents, the number of agents waiting. So normally, obviously, if you're queuing, there's not going to be any agents waiting. But, call centers exist in an environment where sometimes you queue and sometimes you don't. When you're not queuing, it's good to know, well, how many agents are sitting around waiting for phone calls. So that's a real-time piece of data. And then when you look at an individual agent and you want to know, and of course we do this a lot when we're doing an adherence check and we're saying, okay, what is this person doing? Well, whatever that status is, that is real-time, at least since the last system refresh. So that's your real-time data. And then you have what I like to term as near real-time data. And there's a lot of things you can put in this category. I put in here, service level and average speed of answer. And I put that here because a lot of people have this on real-time displays. Not a problem with that. In fact, we're going to talk about some displays in just a little bit, and I like seeing them there. But it's important for everyone to understand that they're near real-time numbers. They're not real-time. So service level and ASA, what you may see, it really depends on how your system is set up. Sometimes people set it up so that this data is, up to date for the day. So if it's, I'm in the Eastern time zone here, so it's about 10 minutes after 2. So if that's how my system would be set up, and I looked and I saw service level is saying 42, well, that's telling me it's 42% from the start of the day. So sometimes it's set up that way, but sometimes it's only set up from, for instance, the start of the interval. So if I'm on half-hour intervals, my interval started at 2 o'clock p.m., I see a 42. That's telling me, well, I've got a 42 service level, but just for the last 11 minutes. It doesn't really tell me what was going on prior to that. And then sometimes it's a rolling 10 minutes or a rolling 15 minutes. So there's all different ways to express that. So it's important to know how your system has been set up when you look at the real-time data. And the same thing holds true for abandon rate and number of calls abandoned and that sort of thing. You really have to know how it's set up. But however it's set up, it's not real-time. It's not actual to this moment. The numbers on the left are to this moment. Numbers on the right are some rolling average based on whatever starting point you've put in there. Okay, so that's the distinction between real-time and near real-time. So now how might you go about displaying it? Okay, well, I just took, and I use this a lot when I'm consulting with folks, this or something similar to it, but a lot of people have that question about, what really should it look like? There's X amount of real estate that we can have on a real-time display, whether you're talking about a panel on a wall or whether you're talking about a screen on an agent or a supervisor's desktop. And because there's only so much real estate, we want to make sure that we get the most out of what's out there. So every organization is a little bit different. Sometimes you have to add, things and delete other things. But this is generally what I look at and say, this is kind of how I like things set up. And in this particular example, I'm imagining an organization that's got 3 basic queues, a service queue, a sales queue, and a tech support queue. And I like it kind of broken up between that real-time and near real-time sort of data so that I don't confuse them. So over on the left where I've got current conditions, that truly is current conditions. That's what's happening at this particular moment. And I want to see how many calls are in queue and what's the longest wait. And I like having that first as I read left to right, because that's the most serious situation. If I have a lot of calls in queue, that's usually the thing that's going to trigger the response the most. So I look at those things, but I'd also like to know about how many agents are ready and how many agents are logged on. Agents ready is important to me because if I'm in a non-queuing situation, I want to know if I've got too many people sitting around, and if I do, maybe I need to get a training class together or that sort of thing. And the number of agents logged on gives me something to compare to a schedule. So those are all real-time metrics over there, and they give me something that I can compare to. And you can see down in the notes, I've provided some information about what I'm going to compare these numbers to. So that's the left side of the dashboard. The right side then starts to talk a little bit about, and I'm going to use the word context in a little bit when we go a little bit further, but it starts to give me a little bit more of that context, because it's great to get the snapshot, and that's the left side, but it is just a snapshot. And, I want to be able to understand, well, how does this play into all the other snapshots that have happened today? And things like service level and abandon percent tell me some of that. They give me some kind of an indication. The number of calls handled compared to recent history or a forecast or something like that gives me an idea if the day is tracking as expected, or if maybe it's just a really busy day more than anybody expected. And the same with handle time as well. So I've got a left side of the dashboard that gives me that snapshot. I've got a right side of the dashboard as I look at it that gives me some of that context. So the whole idea being, I want to be able to look at it, whether it's on the wall, whether it's on my desktop, and really quickly figure out what's going on. An example with some numbers in it and some colors is on this slide here where we display the metrics. So in this particular case, some things really pop out because we're using color to try and draw the eye to it. So you see right up front, hey, I'm having problems in service, right? I'm having problems right now. I've got 14 calls in queue, and the longest wait is getting close to 10 minutes. So I know I've got a fairly serious situation there. And then as I follow that to the right, I find out, and this is not the only time that this has happened today, right? I'm seeing a lower service level. I'm seeing a really pretty high abandon percent, at least compared to my objectives that are listed below there. So I don't have to do a whole lot of calculating to figure out, okay, I know where I've got a problem. And then the nice part of this is you drop down to the next line and you see, well, I've got kind of the exact opposite situation here in sales, right? Here in sales, I've had a great day. I've got a 98% service level. My abandon percent is 0. I've got 12 agents. I've got 17 agents on the phone. 12 of them don't have a call. Now, I specifically put these numbers in. It's the great thing about putting presentations together. You can make the numbers say whatever you want to say, but this is just a really good example of how a display like this can really trigger quick information and quick responses, because the obvious situation here is I've got too many people sitting around in sales and I need some help in service. So however I do that in this organization, whether, hopefully it's done within the call routing and I can just move those calls over, but if not, and if I had to manually move them, I'm at least getting that trigger that says, hey, something's got to happen here. And by seeing both sides of that equation, the calls in queue and the agents ready, and seeing that all in one place, I can respond to that really quickly. So lots of different ways that you can set up a dashboard, but I think in the end, what you really do want to see is you want to get the quick conditions and you want to get some context related to it so that you can really respond more quickly and you can respond more consistently too, that everybody that looks at it gets the same type of impression. Okay, so that's a lot of information about, the basics as we talk to them regarding contact center metrics, calls in queue, service level abandonment. And when you spend a lot of time on that, the question's always raised, well, what about other data? Customer satisfaction, quality, sales, first contact resolution is a good one. Well, my take on that is, all of that, well, not all of it, the ones that I've listed there, at least anyway, are every bit as important as that real-time data. And I think I can easily make the argument that some of them are more so. Before I consulted, I worked in a service-related contact center. So those of you that did that, I mean, the mission of a service contact center is customer satisfaction. That's why we're there. So I think I could make the argument that a customer sat rating may be the most important thing because, I mean, let's face it, if we're not delivering customer satisfaction, I mean, what else really matters? Does it matter that we're answering the call quickly? Does it matter that our handle times are good? I mean, a lot of that doesn't matter if we're not fulfilling the mission of the organization. So, yeah, that other data really is important and maybe even more so. So you say, well, gosh, shouldn't that be on a real-time dashboard? Well, there's the difference. That data is not as urgent. And that's what we talk about when we talk about real-time data. And that's part of the vocabulary that I think is really helpful to use when you're talking about that data. You're not talking about the most important data. You're talking about the urgent data, the things that really require a quick response if you're going to correct them. Now, that's not to say, if your customer sat scores are low, should you ignore it? Of course not. We should do whatever we can to try and improve that, but it's not like it has to be, we have to take the first step this minute or the next minute. In fact, we're better off not doing that. We're better off taking our time and getting a lot of input and slowly building a strategy for that. But we don't have that luxury with this other data, with the real-time data. So I'll use that word a lot. I'll use that word urgent and urgency a lot because I don't want to confuse it with importance. I think the real-time data is important, but I'm certain that it's very urgent. Okay, so that's some of the metrics. Now let's roll on here and talk a little bit about this idea of chance and how does chance play a role in the metrics that I'm seeing and how I may respond to it. Well, everything that we do in contact centers, all of the staffing calculations, all of the forecasting calculations, they all have assumptions behind them. And I'll focus mainly on the staffing calculation here. And if you're using a workforce management system or if you're using some other type of tool, you're probably using Erlang C to figure out how many people do I need on the phone. You figure out a volume, you figure out a handle time, get it all mixed up, and it's that calculation we call Erlang C that says, well, okay, then you need X number of people to meet your service level goal. But and within that Erlang calculation, there's actually a number of assumptions. So handle time, for instance, is a factor within the Erlang calculation. But if your handle time is 450 seconds, well, Erlang doesn't assume that every single call is 450 seconds. It actually ascribes a range to that, and it understands that some calls will be shorter than that, some will be longer. And if you looked at that range and you charted it, it's more or less a bell-shaped curve. It's not an exact bell-shaped curve, but we'll call it that for purposes of discussion. And that's something that generally holds true over time. So if you take a day's worth of phone calls, or certainly a week or a month's worth of phone calls, and you plotted them on a graph, you would see this, somewhat skewed bell-shaped curve that looks exactly like the curve that Erlang C is using when it's making its calculations. So over time, these things hold true. But within short spans of time, 1 minute, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, they may not. So if I just took 3 minutes of your data and I looked at the call handle times for completed calls during those 3 minutes, they may average the 450, but it may be skewed. They may be out on the extremes, and they may be all packed into one particular minute or 2 minutes, the longer ones in 1 minute and the shorter ones in another. So strange things can happen in the short time spans that you never see happen in the longer time spans because of the law of large numbers. And that is where the role of chance comes in for us. So, and here's an example of how that takes effect. So here's an average handle time, which happens to be 451 seconds, right? And if you looked at a 15-minute interval and you plotted the handle time for each minute, which is what this graph is showing, I mean, you'd normally see something that looks pretty much like the graph in front of you right now. There's no points exactly on the average. There's, about half above, about half below, and they're spread out, 1 minute's below, next minute's above, that sort of thing. Then you might get a couple below and a couple above. But what you're seeing in this slide here is really kind of what you always see, or normally are going to see in a 15-minute interval. However, every now and then, you're going to see this scenario 2 pop up, okay? And again, the average is the same. This is, again, an interval with a 451-second handle time. So at the end of the day, when you look at these 2 intervals, you're inclined to say, wow, the handle time was the same for both of them. But in this particular scenario, just by chance, a bunch of the longer calls stacked up earlier in the interval. And you can see that from 10:01 to 10:05 or so, they're all over the average. Then you get one below, and then you're back above the average again for another minute or 2. I can guarantee you, in a situation like this, what you're going to have in this interval is you're going to start queuing. If you've got, just the right number of people on the phone, if you don't have overstaffing, you're probably going to start queuing around the 2nd or 3rd minute, and it's going to last well into the 9th and 10th and 11th minute. And it would be really hard to figure out at the end of the interval what happened because, again, in this case, you got the handle time that you expected. It's just a case of chance in action. And it doesn't happen a lot in call centers, but, it does happen from time to time. So we just have to keep the thought in the back of our mind that, strange things can happen during very short time intervals, and that possibility always exists when we're looking at the data. Which leads us right into, okay, so what do we do then? If we know that, we can count on, some consistency over time, but in real time, we look at what's going on now, and that's impacted by what happened in the last minute or 2. Well, then what do I do with that idea of chance? Okay, so we'll get into that in a minute. What we typically see is, as far as reaction plans go, is a progression in contact centers. There's a phase 1 where an organization really doesn't have a plan at all when you talk about reacting to real-time conditions. In fact, they may not even be looking at real-time conditions in phase 1, right? And if they are looking at them, there's just not a comfort with what has to be done. So phase 1, there's really no plan at all. In phase 2, and obviously what happens in phase 1 is, things aren't going well, right? Because we're not responding appropriately. So a phase 2 comes about where somebody says, hey, we have to have some accountability, and they'll put somebody in a role and say, hey, this is your job now. Make sure that, if things go bad, we do something. Hopefully it's a little bit more detailed than that direction there. But it's not a lot more detailed. And I call this phase individual discretion because while we hand accountability off, we're not taking the time to get detailed and say exactly what should happen. So, as more and more people get involved because, we're open, 80 or 120 hours. So, we've got, 3 people that do this for a living, and, we've got backups and backups to the backups. And also, there's 8, 10, 12 people in the organization that may hold this accountability at some time. But they all have these different opinions, and somebody is on the desk and sees 10 calls in queue and starts reacting, and somebody else sees 20 calls in queue and thinks, oh, that's no big deal, that'll take care of itself. So a lot of differences in the individual view of it. So that doesn't work too well. So it moves on to phase 3, where now we start giving a little more detail, and we tell these 8 or 10 or 12 people, we say, hey, look, anytime there's 15 or more calls in queue, you've got to go do something about it. You've got to get everybody on the phone. And that's that basic general guideline, 15 calls in queue with a single tiered response. Get everybody on the phone, okay? And it's really in that phase where people start to see, yeah, things are improving. We're responding more quickly. The problem is we're not responding with a whole lot of accuracy to the situation. We're probably over-responding. In some cases under, in some cases 15 may be too big a queue and it takes too long to break it down. And then there's other times of the day or week where 15 is too small. We can live with 15. We can live with 20 or 25 because the natural flow of things brings it back down, and we can still make our service levels. So that's our phase 3. And then hopefully then people progress up to a phase 4, which is we have to get further defined and we have to have a multi-tiered plan, which is where we're going to go right now. We're going to talk about that well-defined plan, that multi-tiered plan. So if you see yourself there, if you're looking and you're saying, well, we seem like we're, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 is really where you want to get to, because you're not only going to get better reactions, but you're going to get a lot better response from the agents, and they're going to enjoy the environment much more because there's going to be less chaos associated with it. So let's take a look at what that would look like then. Okay, I'm really going to go through 3 ingredients here. And the first ingredient is current conditions, okay? And current conditions actually has 3 of its own ingredients along with it, right? So current conditions means 3 different things have to be in place. The first thing is real-time metrics. So you choose some of those real-time metrics I was speaking about before, calls in queue, longest wait, that sort of thing. Okay, so you have that piece of it. You then have some context. Okay, so I was using the number 15 before when I was talking about 15 calls in queue. Well, if you've got, I'm sure we've got some participants on the phone today with maybe a 20 or 30 seat center. Well, 15 calls in queue is a lot. And that could really cause high abandonment, low service levels. On the other hand, we probably have people on the phone that have a 500 seat center, right? And 15 calls in queue is just, it's probably not worthy of even noticing, because that's just the ebb and flow of a call center of that size. So we have to have some context to some of those numbers so that they give us more meaning. So number of agents manned is a great one. And then what we want to have to really understand current conditions is some trending, right? So if we have that situation where there's 15 calls in queue and we've only got 25 agents manned, and so we're looking at it, we're saying, wow, that's a lot of calls in queue for the resources that we have. Now let's throw service level for the day into it, because maybe service level is 99%. And if it is, well, maybe that should impact our response to the situation. On the other hand, maybe service level is 22%. And maybe that would create a different response to those same conditions, 15 calls in queue, 25 agents, but I may respond differently based on that trending. So those 3 items combined, real-time metrics with context and trending, make that first ingredient to a real-time reaction plan. And I don't know why that's continuing to do that. The next ingredient then is a time frame. So the next consideration is, okay, so now we have an understanding of what's going on. What's the time frame associated with this? So we don't just want to have a reaction where, hey, 15 calls in queue and we do this. If we react too short, if the time frame is too short and we react too quickly, we can cause a lot of overreacting. Okay, so if 15 calls in queue, if we've got a 60 or 80 or 100 seat center, that's not that much. And if we're constantly responding to that, then we're constantly taking people on the phone and off the phone and on the phone and off the phone. And it's almost like that natural variation that comes with any call center. We're not letting it be natural. We're trying to react to it every single time a little bit of variation happens. And, while you may think it's doing a good job from a service level perspective, it's driving staff nuts. So we don't want to be too short with our time frame. On the other hand, we don't want to be too long. If we're going to wait a very long time before we react, if we're going to say, okay, 15 calls in queue, we'll start watching it, and if it's that way, for half an hour, then we'll do something. Well, that's too long. Anyone that's worked in the contact center knows an awful lot can happen to a queue in half an hour, and we can put ourselves to the point where now we're so far behind, it'll take us the rest of the day in order to respond. So there's a real art in trying to figure out, well, what is the right time frame? I don't want to react too quick. Then again, I don't want to wait too long. That's our second ingredient. Our final ingredient then is going to be the action that we take. And this is going to look a little bit like a Goldilocks fable here. So on the left is that reaction that's too big, right? So an example of that may be, okay, there's 15 calls in queue, so we're going to take, 20 people from sales, and we're going to put 10 supervisors and 10 email people on the phone. Well, we're putting more people on the phone than what we have calls in queue. And that, in this context may sound odd to say something like that, but it's the type of thing that happens a lot when organizations aren't really watching what's really going on moment to moment in their within their contact center. So we don't want a reaction that's too big. Likewise, we don't want a reaction that's too small. If we've got 15 calls in queue and we put one more person on the phone, that's probably not going to be enough. It's going to take a long time to take care of that. What we're looking for is a right-sized response. And, that comment tends to throw people a little bit, because if you read what it says there, quickly stabilize the situation. Okay, so you don't want it to get any worse, right? We don't want the queue to get larger. We want to stop the queue from growing, and then we want to start slowly bringing it back. And it's that word slow, I think, that makes people pause. But in fact, that's the only way that you can make sure that it's a right-size reaction. If you're going to go in there and try and fix a situation in 2 minutes, the only way to do that is to really overreact. The only way to do that is to find as many people as there are calls in queue. Yeah, they'll get the calls out of queue, but now you're stuck with too many people on the phone, and if you're going to do that sort of thing, you're going to be constantly moving them back and forth. Every 5 minutes, they're on the phone, they're off the phone, they're on the phone, they're off the phone, and that's not the best use of your resources. So that Goldilocks reaction, that right-size reaction, is the one that stabilizes and then slowly improves the situation. So that's 3 ingredients. That's conditions and a time frame and an action associated with it. So this is, you put it all together, and this is how it looks. And this is just an example. It's not meant to say this is the way it should be, and obviously it's what your plan is going to vary by the size of your organization, your service level objective, etc. But it should look something like this. A 3-tiered approach is a great way to do it. 4, 5, and 6, it just gets a little too complex, and 2 usually isn't enough. And in this particular example, we're looking at a tier 1 where, the queue gets above 10, and what we're using here for context is a ratio of queued calls to man agents, right, of 1 to 3 or less. So 10 calls in queue, 30 people, okay, or less than 30 people. So if you're in that situation and service level is at or above standard for 3 minutes or so, that's when you're going to start doing something. And what are you going to do? Well, in this particular case, if you look down at the action, Number 1 move, adherence check. Number 2 move, transition email staff to phones. And the reason that those items are there is this organization, whatever size it is, knows that doing those 2 things, an adherence check might get them 3 or 4 people on the phone. Maybe they've got 5 email staff. There's only ever 3 there at one time. They know that they're going to get 6, 8, 10, something like that, something that will hit that right-sized reaction to the situation that they're looking at, where they're going to have 10, 12, 13 calls in queue for a few minutes. So that's why those actions are chosen. Then you have a tier 2 where obviously, the queue has grown and, comparing it to the manned agents looks even worse. But the thing that's interesting to note is this is the kind of thing that maybe you would do immediately, because in this case, what you've said is service level for the day is below standard. So you've got to a point where, well, it's at a tier 2. This is obviously a smaller organization because we're responding pretty quickly to 15 calls in queue. And we're saying, hey, look, if service level for the day is fine, we may not jump into tier 2. But if we're already below standard for the day, then we will. That makes a lot of sense. And that's where time frames can really help you out. And then there's, another 4 actions that are related to that particular move. Tier 3 then, which means things are really getting bad, things are getting difficult. Now our queue is above 20, and we probably don't have more than 20 people on the phone. And here what we're saying is, I don't care what service level is, I don't care what's going on with volume. If it gets to this point and it's done it for 5 minutes, it's all out now, So what we're going to do is, we'll have done those 6 other things in tier 1 and tier 2, and now we're going to do the last 2 things that we have. We don't have anything else after this, right? So we're going to do those last 2 things that we have and hang on and hope that takes care of things for us. So that's how a typical plan would look. And again, yours may be a little bit different here or there, but I love having those 3 ingredients: a condition, a time frame, and associated actions. And I think if we think of it in those ways and think of it of a few different tiers, 2 or 3 different tiers, then we've really got the responses that we want to get, and we get them on a more consistent basis and with a lot less chaos. Okay, so if you have questions about those, please feel free to put them in a chat. I'll answer them as we finish up here. I've just got one more agenda item, fairly quick. It's the last piece of it. It's communicating with agents. I run into this a lot. I think one of the wonderful things about being a consultant is that when you get the opportunity to meet with agents, they're really very open, they're very honest about the organization and how they feel about it and what they feel causes them stress in their particular day. And so the things that you're seeing here is really me just relating what I hear from agents when I get the opportunity to sit down with them. And these are the things that drive them nuts when they hear them. Training is canceled again. Now, occasionally, yeah, it's okay. We all get it. It's a call center. Things happen. But in a lot of organizations, it gets canceled again and again and again, to the point where people stop even showing up for it. Eventually it finally does take hold, but no one's there because they just figured it was going to get canceled. So, and it just gives a bad message. It gives that message that, the whole professional development idea is something that we're just not serious about. Get off rap and take a call. Well, you asked me to document calls. Well, and now you're telling me don't document the call. I need some kind of consistency in that. One of my favorites, the workforce management team says you need to get on the phone. So yes, of course, it's them. They're pure evil. The people that watch the numbers all day. And I've actually heard that comment before, so it's interesting. Changing activities because executives are in the call center, obviously sends a bad message. And that last one would just, personally drives me nuts is that butts in seats comment. And I know we use it a lot in contact centers. I'd like to just banish it. We know how important our agents are. And I know we don't, when we say it, we don't really mean it. But eventually somebody says that in front of other people, and it just says the worst thing about what the organization thinks about their agents. So you know, we know they're not. They're not butts and seats. These are really important people in our organization, and we want to make sure that we present that. So, and these are the things that then I hear, you know, when I'm having group discussions and individual one-on-one sessions with agents. They only care about productivity, you know. That's why they cancel the training classes. They only care about productivity. We don't matter to them. Our job is bottom of the rung. And these are the things that really grate on folks. So rather than focus on the bad, here's a few, as we're leaving, a few other phrases that I love using in the right scenarios. And this first one is, you know, let's not tell people they have to get on the phone or the workforce management team says you have to get on the phone. Let's say, hey, there's customers that have been waiting, and they've been waiting over 3 minutes. Could you help them? Because that really is the message. You know, the workforce management team isn't the source of the problem when they say get on the phone. They're simply relaying a message that, hey, there's customers waiting out there, and that's a job to serve them. So that's a much better way to do it. I love that second one, and you get this a lot when people start talking about, well, you only care about productivity and answering calls, and no one cares about quality. Well, you know, the fact of the matter is answering calls quickly really is part of customer satisfaction. So part of our commitment here is telling the caller we respect their time. We respect their time by not making them wait in queue. So it really does all tie together with a customer. So that's important. And, you know, when it's over, for those people that have jumped on and helped out, thanking them. Thanks for helping out. Really made a difference. We got through that queue in 20 minutes. You know, we had the same queue last week, and it took us over an hour. So thanks for all your help. We need to go back after we have these events and do that sort of thing. And the last item, which whenever I present it causes all kinds of disagreement, so feel free to speak up about it, because I know a lot of people feel like, you know, supervisor's an important role, and it really is. And, you know, I can't be taking supervisors off of the floor and putting them on the phones. And I would certainly agree. You can't do that to any great extent. A supervisor's role comprises too many things to do that. However, time and time again, I hear from reps that when they feel like they're being supported, when I ask why, almost to a person, the first thing I hear is, my supervisor jumps on the phone when it's busy. It's a big deal. They notice it. And it doesn't have to be 2 hours, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And people notice it, and they feel like, well, okay, everybody's in this together. You know, we got to just knuckle down and do it. So realize not everybody can do it, but I know it has a lot of sticking power with the agents and really helps with engagement in an organization. Okay. So, Jim, I'll hand things back over to you. That brings us to the end. And any questions or anything like that, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jay. Great stuff, as usual. I just wanted to confirm that workforce management teams really are not pure evil, right?
I couldn't agree more, but I've actually, it's funny, I've heard that, and I've mentioned before to folks, I once met with a workforce management team where that was going on, and they actually told me that when they left the office every day, they left in pairs. So that's not a good sign.
Okay. Yeah, that's not a good sign.
And I can verify they were not evil people. They were actually very nice people, but it's the way things happen sometimes.
That's very funny. Maybe not for them. But, Jay, I do have a couple questions for you, but we have a few minutes left here. I've got one here that says, well, maybe speaking of workforce management, who should be doing the adherence checks, and should it be a centralized workforce management person, evil person, or a supervisor?
Yeah, it would seem odd for me to say workforce management now after having said that, right?
Right.
So I think, you know, and in a larger organization, you really have to have, I use the term traffic controller, right? Like you have to have somebody at the helm that's, you know, pretty much watching it all the time. Obviously, they can and should be doing other things. I mean, staring at a screen for 40 hours a week isn't a great idea. But I think the task, the responsibility of watching that in a larger organization does need to be centralized, and workforce management is a good place for it. However, having said that, the question becomes, well, okay, when there is a problem and people aren't adhering, who needs to take care of that? And in my opinion, I think that works out a whole lot better when that last act of somebody going to the agent and saying, hey, you're supposed to be on the phone right now and we have some calls in queue, I think that's better done by the supervisors. I think having supervisors do them, first of all, it gets them involved in the process. They're not completely removed, because if they're not involved in that piece, they're not involved in any of it from a real-time management perspective, and that's not a great situation. But I think maybe the bigger part is, a traffic control and workforce management isn't writing people's performance appraisals. They're not trained in communication methods and how to deliver tough messages and things like that. So they're just not in a position where they can do that really well. So I think watching over things is workforce management, but actually communicating then with the agents, I think getting a supervisor involved is a better route to take.
Makes sense. I think that answered the question pretty well. Everyone on the call, I would just encourage you, if you've got a question, to go ahead and type it in now in the Q&A section while we still got Jay on the phone here. And while he answers this next one, Jay, this is kind of a two-parter, I guess. It says, how can you tell when you are overreacting, and conversely, how can I tell when we are underreacting?
Okay. All right. So let me do overreacting first, because that happens a lot. I mean, a lot of our contact centers, I think, fall under that category of micro-controlled, a little bit too much micromanagement going on. So I think, first of all, you're probably going to hear it from the agents. I don't know that that's, the least biased source where it's going to come from, but, I think you're going to hear it from them. But I think also that there's a couple of other things. I think it's a terrific strategy, and I probably should have said this in the presentation. We talk about these real-time reactions and invoking certain responses. I think the last thing you want to do after you're thanking people is tally them up. How many times did we go into Tier 1 reaction? How many times did we go into Tier 2? How many times did we go into Tier 3? If you've got, most of us have, 8 or 10 core hours in a day. Even if we're open for 24, there's, probably 8 to 10 that are core where a lot of this queuing goes on. If you look at that and you're seeing 15, 20, 25, 30 reactions a day, well, that's too much. So, maybe the problem is you're understaffed, and you have to deal with that. But in any event, even if you're understaffed, that's too much reacting, and nobody's going to be able to get the chance to get into a rhythm regarding off-phone stuff and coaching and training and those types of things. So I think tracking it is a great way to see, hey, am I overreacting here or not? And if you're leaning on it too much, there's another bigger problem that you have to address. So that's the over, and so you also asked about the under reacting as well, right?
Right. Yeah, it was two-parter. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So how do you know if you're not reacting quickly enough or often enough or that sort of thing? So let's see. I think in that case, well, you're I think. Well, you're going to see it probably in service levels for sure. But I think also in the event history, if you start to look at it, if you remember that one slide I had where I talk about a right-sized response, the first thing you want to do is stabilize the situation, right? So if you're waiting too long to respond or you're underreacting with too small a response, you're not stabilizing. So if that's your issue, I'd probably be looking at, okay, what's happening when I'm responding, and how long is it taking for me to get this back into order? And I'd also be looking at, like that first 5 minutes when I invoke that reaction plan. What's happening in the first 5 minutes? Because if the queue is going up, well, then I'm not doing enough then to stabilize the situation. So you almost think of it as a triage, and if you put it in healthcare terms, what you're supposed to do in those first few minutes is stop the bleeding, right? So that's, if you're not successfully doing that, then I think you have to start to look at, hey, we're not doing enough. We have to find other ways to be able to respond more quickly to these events.
Got it. Thanks, Jay. That makes perfect sense. And I don't see any other questions queued up, so I think that's it for the Q&A. So
okay.
I wanted to thank everyone for their time, and as I mentioned, this is a quarterly forum, and so the next one will be in the September timeframe on tips and tricks for queue management. So we thank you for your participation, and we will see you for the next session in September. Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Jay.
All right, thanks. Appreciate it.